Today I want to talk about the upcoming GoPro Hero 10. This will not be a tutorial or a test, rather I just want to tell you what is already known, what we can realistically expect from the Hero 10 and what would be my top 10 wishlist. So just sit back and don't forget to let me know your opinion later. Let's get to the facts first. In the last few years, GoPro has always introduced a new Hero Black in September. The only exception was the Hero 8 Black, which was introduced in early October. The date in the fall is of course chosen intentionally. The camera is supposed to achieve a certain level of popularity before Black Friday, before the important holiday shopping season. Other tech companies like Apple also often introduce their new products in September or October. So we can assume a September launch this year as well. And contrary to what is often said on various channels that GoPro is economically down, the company has recovered very well over the past year. The stock has performed well and the company is operating profitably again. Meanwhile, more than 1 million users have subscribed to the cloud service and GoPro is trying to go more the way of a lifestyle brand, selling clothes, backpacks and sunglasses, and less the way of a classic tech company that sells a wide variety of hardware products. But that's precisely why this one camera per year is particularly important for GoPro. And it's also important that the product is of high quality and works. Because ultimately the brand image also depends on this one product. If we now look at the development of the hardware, it is noticeable that GoPro has used the same image sensor for several years. Therefore, it was quite special that GoPro finally introduced a new sensor last year with the Hero 9 Black. The new sensor with 20 megapixels enables a video resolution of 5K, albeit only with a maximum of 30 frames per second. And of course higher resolution photos than the old sensor with 12 megapixels. In contrast, GoPro has been using the same processor, the so-called GP1, since the Hero 6. It is also interesting for the development of the camera that there has been a quite good alternative to the GoPro for 2 years with the DJI Osmo Action. Especially the front display of the Osmo Action was a special feature in the beginning. GoPro was rightly forced to follow suit and also install a front display on the Hero 9. A GoPro is no longer just a camera for classic action shots. The front display is especially important for vloggers, or simply for anyone who wants to film themselves. What has surprised me so far is that DJI has still not announced a successor for the Osmo Action. But perhaps such a successor awaits us in the fall as well. All rumors that are circulating at the moment are basically based on the facts mentioned. There have only been specific leaks in the past few years shortly before the launch. So let's take a look at what can realistically be expected from the GoPro Hero 10. As mentioned earlier, the Hero 9 finally featured a new image sensor. For this reason alone, it is very unlikely that GoPro will use a new sensor again after just 1 year. The sensors are not manufactured by GoPro itself, but come from Sony. It is often assumed that the new GoPro will be able to shoot in 8K. Personally, I think this is very unlikely for the reason mentioned. 8K requires a sensor with 33 megapixels. However, the Hero 9 sensor only has 20 megapixels, so it won't be able to shoot in 8K. 8K would be great for promoting a new camera, of course. Although I don't think it would make sense for an action camera. Of course, to make 8K possible, GoPro could opt for a sensor with more megapixels. But a sensor with more megapixels would also make little sense for GoPro for other reasons. Let's assume that you distribute more pixels on a sensor of the same size, then in simple terms, the individual pixels have to become smaller and can therefore absorb less light. More pixels therefore usually mean disadvantages in low light. The GoPro is already not very good in low light. A sensor of the same size with 33 megapixels would perform even worse in low light. Now of course, one could still assume that GoPro could also install a larger sensor. Many would like to see a 1-inch sensor, for example like the one used in the Sony RX0. However, such a large sensor also has disadvantages for an action camera. Have you noticed that with the GoPro everything is always in focus? Objects only get out of focus when they are too close to the camera. This is because the GoPro has a fixed focus that is set to infinity. This way everything is in focus except for the areas very close to the camera. However, the larger the sensor gets, the smaller the area that is in focus and the larger the autofocus area. With a sensor size of 1 inch, a fixed focus set to infinity would therefore not make sense. An area too big close to the camera would be out of focus. It would therefore require an autofocus, which I think is a disadvantage for an action camera. There would always be situations where the shot would be out of focus and therefore blurry. Long story short, I don't think GoPro will use a new sensor for the Hero 10, so it will still be a 20 megapixel sensor and 8K will not be possible. Is 6K possible with this sensor? That's another question, and I think it might actually be technically possible. So please correct me if I'm wrong on that. So while it will almost certainly stay with the same image sensor, GoPro has been using the same processor for several years now. With the Hero 6, GoPro introduced its own new custom processor, the GP1. While the name is closely related to Apple's naming scheme, so instead of A1 or Apple 1, GP1 or GoPro 1, GoPro has not introduced a new improved version every year, but has stuck with the GP1 to this day. Sure, the whole system has been optimized, but there is still no GP2. That could change this year. Now, what advantages could a stronger processor bring? The camera would be more responsive, would turn on faster, and could of course process much more data. That in turn could lead to a better image quality, for example an improvement in dynamic range. The GoPro still has problems with difficult lighting conditions. That is, when there are very dark and very bright areas in the same image. Often the bright areas in the image then burn out. Anyone who has seen my comparison between the Hero 9 and the iPhone 12 knows that the iPhone handles these situations better, so I expect better dynamic range from the Hero 10. However, this is not to be confused with HDR video. HDR video refers more to display technology and in my opinion would make little sense for GoPro, because most still don't use an HDR capable display. Of course, we can also expect improved stabilization again, so a new improved version of the hyper-smooth stabilization. A stronger processor would also be helpful for this. Then we can hope for 4K with 120 frames per second. So far the Hero 9 is only capable of shooting 4K at 60 frames per second. 4K 120 would make it possible to shoot fantastic slow motion footage. And as we know, even some full-frame cameras are now capable of this. However, it is clear that 4K 120 would also lead to very large files and would probably also overwhelm many computers of typical consumers. Likewise, the new camera could also be capable of shooting in 5K at 60 frames per second. The Hero 9 clearly produces the best image in 5K, but can only do 5K at a maximum of 30 frames per second. 5K 60 could certainly be possible and would definitely be a step forward. Apart from that, you can of course expect some minor improvements to the body, a better display both at the front and the back. Who knows, maybe a more efficient battery usage and therefore longer runtimes. However, all this does not sound very spectacular. Would a new processor, more dynamic range, 4K 120, 5K 60, an even better stabilization and other minor improvements be enough of a selling point? Or has GoPro thought of something very special for this year? Here we can probably only speculate at the moment. That's why I would like to tell you at this point what I personally would like to see from the Hero 10. And because we're talking about the Hero 10, I put 10 things on my wish list. I would definitely want a GoPro that runs stable from day one. So a GoPro without crashes and bugs. For this, we usually had to wait several months and make several updates. All this is of course not beneficial for GoPro's brand image. Therefore, please GoPro, this year a camera that makes no problems from the beginning. Unfortunately, the Hero 9 also became larger and heavier due to the use of the new sensor and the new front display. In my opinion, this is not an ideal development for an action camera. I would like to see a smaller and lighter camera. Then of course I would also like to see the higher frame rates that I mentioned above, so 4K 120 and 5K 60. And since we're on the subject of realistic improvements, I would of course also like to see more dynamic range. Burned out highlights should finally be a thing of the past. One clear weakness of the Hero 9 is the touch display. It is not very responsive and in my opinion even worse than the touch display of older GoPro cameras. Therefore I would like to see a better touch display of course. Optimally it should also be larger and no longer have these thick black bezels. All of this is quite expectable. So let's move on to somewhat more demanding wishes. The GoPro has various fields of view, wide, linear, narrow. This is a kind of digital zoom which always involves a loss of quality. Here of course it would be great if GoPro could somehow manage to incorporate some kind of optical zoom. Or a second lens with a different focal length. Of course that would require a completely new body and design. The Max Lens mod was a cool innovation in this context. Since I often color grade my shots, I would like to have more flexibility for color grading. The GoPro produces footage with 8-bit color depth. 10-bit color would bring significantly more color gradations. For example, significantly more shades of red or blue. This would bring much more flexibility for color grading. I often use my GoPro for skiing. Here there are always problems with the cold. This is of course due to the battery, which has difficulty with the cold. GoPro has already made some improvements here. I would definitely like to see a camera that is even more cold resistant. As already mentioned, the GoPro still has problems in low light conditions. A camera that could handle this better would of course be an advantage. However, if the Hero 10 uses the same sensor and lens, a significant improvement in low light is unlikely. What would certainly be possible is a substantial low light improvement for photos. In other words, a kind of real night mode, which many smartphones now have, that is a digitally stabilized long exposure mode. That alone would be an interesting innovation. Finally, I would of course like to have a better sound quality. I realize that the waterproof body has certain limitations, yet the GoPro's sound has hardly improved over the years. And that's it with my list. What improvements would you like to see and what do you expect? Just write me in the comments. Soon enough, we'll know more and I'll show you what the Hero 10 can really do. Give me a like as feedback if the video was interesting for you and see you next time.